The date is June 14th, 1921. It's around 6 a.m. and the sun is just starting to rise above the horizon, shining its light down onto the picturesque forested mountain landscape that Sussex County and northwest New Jersey are known for. A light, early summer breeze dances its way through the trees and vegetation that grow alongside the Morris Turnpike, a roadway that winds its way through the forests and over the various hills in Byram Township. As the breeze continues its journey through the landscape, it gently brushes by a man who's pulled off on the side of the road working on his motorcycle. Albert is a local man who is known to frequently take his motorcycle to work during the summer, enjoying the early morning rides along the Morris Turnpike, taking in the sights and sounds of nature that surround the roadway. As he is knelt down alongside his bike inspecting the faulty engine, a green and yellow 2-ton truck bearing the name Sussex Print Works, Newton, New Jersey, in gold letters passes him by while its occupants waved in his direction. Albert, recognizing the two men in the truck, raised his hand to return the friendly gesture. The truck continued on its way, kicking up dust and rocks from the roadway, and Albert watched as it crested the top of Catswamp Hill. After the truck disappeared from his sight, Albert returned to working on his bike. After making a few more tweaks to the finicky motor, the bike was back up and running, and Albert could finally get back on his way to his job at the salt and gravel plant in Stanhope. He headed in the same direction as the silk plant truck, hoping he could make up some time on his way to not be late for work. As he crested the Catswamp Hill, he was surprised to see the truck stopped in the middle of the road, with both of its occupants being led into the woods at gunpoint by a group of masked men. He hit his brakes and slid to a stop, but by the time Albert realized what was going on, he too was now staring down the barrel of a gun. On the night of June 13th, a taxi driver from Easton, Pennsylvania, Tony Turkos, and 5 of his gang members were sitting around a table of a Newton Inn, passing around a whiskey bottle, each man taking swigs of the liquor to try and calm their nerves as they had a big morning ahead of them. Earlier in the day, Tony and his men had arrived in Newton to stake out the Sussex Print Works factory. Their objective was to hijack one of the silk trucks in the morning while it was headed out for delivery and sell the stolen goods for a nice, ill-gained profit. Sussex County presented as the ideal location to conduct a roadside hijacking, even during the day, as all of its roads cut through dense forested areas away from the prying eyes of the public. Therefore, Tony and his gang chose a stretch of road located in Byram Township to conduct their criminal operation. More specifically, they chose a stretch of the Morris Turnpike that cuts through the forested area known as Catswamp Hill. Early on the morning of June 14th, before the silk truck left the factory in Newton, the gang grabbed their guns and masks and made their way to their chosen ambush site atop the hill in Byram. They hid off the side of the road among the trees and awaited the sound of the heavy delivery truck laboring its way along up the hill. In the truck that morning was Claude Resch and Charles Maines. For them, it was just another one of the semi-weekly deliveries of bolts of silk from the factory. They enjoyed the ride along the Morris Turnpike as it was a relaxing drive through nature before they reached the hustle and bustle of the industrial areas where they would make their deliveries. As they were driving through Byram, they noticed Albert off to the side of the road working on his bike and considered stopping to see if he needed a hand. However, they decided against it as they didn't want to face any repercussions for not making their delivery in time, and instead just offered a friendly wave as they drove past. Seeing his friendly wave in return put their minds at ease and made them feel a little less guilty for not stopping. The delivery truck they were driving wasn't the best with going up hills, and as they started their ascent up Catswamp, the engine sound echoed that fact. The engine roared with all of its might until they finally reached the crest of the hill and leveled out. The truck came up to the small bend in the road atop the hill, when out of the woods jumped 6 masked men, Tony Turkos and his gang, guns drawn in the direction of the 2 delivery men. The truck screeches to a halt as Claude and Charles each instinctively throw their hands up in the air. The group of 6 hijackers split into 2 as 3 of the bandits went to the passenger side and 3 flanked around to the driver's side. They pulled the 2 men out of the truck, put their guns against their heads, and began leading them into the woods. Tony and 2 other gang members stayed by the truck getting things in order while the other 3 were taking Claude and Charles away into the woods. Out of seemingly nowhere, Tony hears the sound of a motorcycle approaching the scene. Sure enough, Albert crests the hill, riding upon his motorcycle, and stumbles across the hijacking in progress. Tony raised his gun in an instant and aimed it at Albert as he began to slow his bike down, almost seeming not to realize the dangerous situation he just rode into. Before Albert even has the chance to come to a full stop, Tony pulled the trigger of his firearm, discharging 1 round that instantly hits Albert and throws him off his bike into the ground. Fellow gang member Angelo Carlino then fired 2 more shots at Albert, both of which hit the now motionless man. Those last 2 shots didn't even matter, as Albert was dead before he even hit the ground. Claude and Charles witnessed the murder as they were being walked into the woods. Seeing now that their lives could be ended just as easily, the 2 delivery men began struggling and pleading for their lives. The bandits smashed each in the back of the head with the butt of a revolver, tied up the men's hands and feet, and dragged them deep into the swampy forest. As this was being carried out, 2 of the gang members grabbed Albert's body and tossed him down the Catswamp embankment. Albert's body landed face down in the creek that ran below. 2 of the gang members got into the delivery truck and drove it away, as Tony, seemingly unsatisfied with the brutality he has already displayed, made his way down the embankment. At any other time, this location would be a peaceful, serene setting, as the water would slowly flow along the creek bed, traversing the beautiful forested landscape. Tony made his way up to Albert's lifeless body, placed his boot on the back of Albert's head, and pressed down, pushing his head into the mud and muck of that creek bed, now corrupting that once peaceful scene. Assured that Albert was dead, Tony went over to where his gang members were standing over the terrified Claude and Charles, those gang members waiting to see what Tony wanted to do with the 2 now witnesses to murder. The group of bandits discussed what their options were and how to handle Claude and Charles. As the discussion transitioned into an argument, one of the bandits swung his rifle in the direction of Charles and fired a shot in his direction, the bullet fortunately missing wide, striking the ground and throwing up dirt a few feet to the side of the tied-up man. The shot caused a scuffle amongst the gang members before they eventually calmed down. Tony explained to the others that he only shot at Albert as he believed Albert could have gone for help and another killing wouldn't be necessary. Angelo Carlino argued that dead bodies would mean no witnesses and therefore allow the gang a faster/easier getaway. Tony, however, being the leader of the group, got his way. The 2 delivery drivers were tied to a tree. Before leaving the 2 men and making their way from the scene, Tony stole $40 from Charles to pay for the trip back to Pennsylvania. He took a $1 bill and threw it back at Charles, saying, "Here, go buy a box of candy for your girl." Claude received a parting threat from one of the other gang members, who bent down to his face and said, "Stay here and starve," which could have only been followed up with a cartoonishly evil laugh. Regardless, the gang then left the 2 drivers stranded in the middle of the woods and made their getaway. As soon as the bandits were out of sight, Claude, with a desperate sort of determination, then began gnawing and chewing at the rope that held Charles's hands together. Losing several teeth in the process and with blood oozing from his mouth, Claude managed to cut through the rope and free his partner's hands, after which Charles was able to remove the remaining bindings. The 2 men, beat up and exhausted, slowly stumbled their way back through the woods. With every step, they had to wonder if they were really so fortunate to be able to survive this grueling attack. What if the gang had purposely left one of the men's ropes loose enough to give them the illusion of being able to survive? The bandits could be watching, off in the distance, letting the men's hopes get higher and higher before they pounce on them, again, finally tearing away any last hope or grip of humanity. But there's no way somebody could be so cruel and sadistic, right? But they had also just seen the cold-blooded killing of Albert only hours ago. The lack of hesitation to toss his lifeless body over the embankment and into the creek, and then the absolute lack of any emotion or remorse as Tony placed the bottom of his boot on the back of Albert's head and pushed it into the creek bed. Any cruel act by Tony and his gang was believable now. Claude and Charles pushed through all of these thoughts until they reached the tree line of the forest and came up to the welcome sight of a farmhouse. The residents of the farmhouse took the 2 men in and contacted the authorities. The Sussex County Sheriff's Department was notified and arrived not too long after. They immediately led a search party into the woods near the original hijacking scene, where they would eventually find the body of Albert Koster face down in the creek. As well as the gruesome murder of Albert, the sheriffs also established that the truck the gang hijacked held a total of around $20,000 worth of now stolen goods, which today is the equivalent of about $326,000. The manhunt for the perpetrators, as well as the stolen truck and goods, was now underway. The next day, a man reported sighting the stolen vehicle on a country road in Kintnersville, Pennsylvania, a small community located just across the Delaware River in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Police went out and confirmed that it was the missing silk plant truck. It was abandoned alongside the road and all of the valuables were missing. The news of this heinous crime spread fast throughout the community. Soon, articles were being written in papers throughout the state, and the story even appeared in some national papers. The press, quite creatively, dubbed the crime the Catswamp Hijacking and Murder. Due to the difficulty of investigating this horrific and now widely publicized crime, The sheriffs were in need of assistance, and they received it in the form of one Herbert C. Irons. The town of Franklin was incorporated in 1913, previously a part of Hardiston Township. It quickly gained the reputation of being one of Sussex County's most successful mining towns. The population grew rapidly as the local zinc mines continued hiring as many workers as possible to extract the abundance of ore from the ground. However, at the same time, Franklin was also developing a reputation as being a rough and tumble town, as all of the rowdy mine workers began starting bar brawls and street fights on a regular basis. The fighting became even more prevalent during World War I, when numerous immigrants from the warring countries emigrated to the area to work in the mines, on top of the residents already there who had ethnic ties to the warring countries. These immigrants and residents would start fights over their differentiating views on the political climate and feelings surrounding the war. The non-stop hostility reached a climax at one point when human remains were found in a local mine shaft and nobody claimed responsibility. This incident forced the Franklin town officials to take action to quell the fighting and other unlawful actions of the townspeople. Therefore, on October 1st, 1915, Herbert C. Irons was hired as Franklin's chief of police, a position he would go on to hold for the next 42 years. Irons had an impressive history, as he had served as a police officer in the Panama Canal Zone before joining the Pennsylvania State Police. Just his presence made an immediate impact in and around Franklin. The mayor would go on to describe him in his introductory press release as a big, muscular chap who does not know what it is to be afraid. Reports would describe how he would ride around town atop his horse, wearing an enormous gray coat, leather puttees, and black boots, bringing the feeling of the Wild West to a newly formed mining town in the east, and bringing law and order with him. He was a no-nonsense officer of the law who was firm but fair, and he was good at it too. When the county sheriffs brought Irons onto the case, he immediately got to work. With his extensive connections stemming from his previous service time with the Pennsylvania State Police, the investigation was driven in the direction of a known gang out of eastern Pennsylvania. This Italian gang, ran by Tony Turkos, was in the midst of a multi-year crime spree, which would see the gang commit numerous crimes throughout eastern Pennsylvania and western New Jersey. Police departments in Pennsylvania had already suspected and started to investigate the gang's involvement in these crimes. With Turkos' gang now being the prime suspects in the Catswamp case, Irons and his associates began their efforts to track them down. Investigators hunted down every lead and tip that came in. After 2 months of empty tips and false leads, Irons was able to track down Turkos' wife. He and fellow officers followed her back to a secluded farm located near Easton. With guns drawn, the group of officers surrounded the property. Officers entered the home and searched for Turkos, finding him in the bedroom. The officers took him into custody without incident. After securing Turkos, Irons noticed a barn on the property and decided that they should check it out. A few of the officers stayed behind with Turkos as Irons led the remaining officers across the property to the barn. The officers opened up the barn doors and were met by numerous piles of hay. Irons and a few of the other officers grabbed pitchforks and other farm tools to poke the piles and check for anybody hiding within. While making their way through the barn, they suddenly heard a rustling noise from a hay pile in the back. Suddenly, a man jumped out of the pile and began running out of the barn. The fleeing man started across the property and towards the distant tree line. Irons and his officers began chasing after him while yelling out commands for him to stop running. The suspect pulled out a pistol and began firing at the pursuing officers, managing to hit Easton police officer Rush Steblin. Seeing one of his men go down, Irons pulled out his sidearm and returned fire, managing to land 4 shots and drop the suspect to the ground. Officers were able to take the man into custody and eventually ID the man as Angelo Carlino, the bandit who wanted to kill the silk truck drivers and leave their bodies in the woods. After a few weeks, the authorities managed to track down and arrest most of the individuals involved in the hijacking and murder at Catswamp Hill. Carlino and fellow criminals James Montana were transferred to the jailhouse in Newton, where they would both be given a fresh shave and positively identified by drivers Resch and Maines as 2 of the bandits who hijacked their truck and were present for the murder of Mr. Koster. These would be the only bandits identified by the victims, as they were the only 2 who had removed their masks. Several of the men were eventually charged with the crimes. However, 2 of the accomplices turned on the group and became witnesses for the state. Aterio Spiracchio, who was the man that drove the group to Newton the night before, and John Merlo, who was paid $60 to haul away the stolen silk. Despite all the individuals involved, there were none quite as notable as gang leader Tony Turkos. Tony Turkos was seen as public enemy number 1 by those in and around the communities where his crimes took place. On January 23, 1922, the trial for Turko began. Turko was able to hire a formidable defense team in Ward and McGinnis with the funds he had accrued through his gang's many heists. The defense attempted to argue that Turko wouldn't be able to receive a fair trial due to the anti-immigrant sentiment that existed from the recent Wall Street bombing perpetrated by an Italian anarchist group. All motions by the defense were dismissed, and the trial moved forward as planned. The prosecution didn't hold back on its end either, revealing the fact that Turko had admitted to the crime to an undercover detective while in jail. Even Turko's defense team had no way to rebut this claim, and only had the hope that it wasn't too incriminating. Unfortunately for them, it was. No source specified exactly when and where this confession took place, however, we have a pretty good idea. Before Irons arrested Turko at the farm in Pennsylvania, Turko, feeling the police getting closer and closer to him, attempted to flee to Italy by way of boat in New York City. The NYPD arrested Turko because he didn't have a passport. Turko reportedly escaped from the transport vehicle while being transported back to the station and made his way to the farm. While in jail in Newton, it seems law enforcement planted undercover officer Eugene Scrivani in the same cell as Turko. Scrivani was an officer with the famed Italian Squad of the NYPD, a group of Italian-American officers who focused their efforts on investigating crimes in the immigrant community. Turko seemingly didn't suspect a thing as he readily confided the stories of his crimes to Scrivani. Scrivani testified at Turko's trial, stating that Turko had said he was sorry for the murder, and he would give his remaining money to the dead man's wife if he could return to Italy. On January 24th, the second day of the trial got underway. The defense called their only witness to the stand, Turko, who promptly denied taking part in any crime and even stated he had never been in the area before. Once each side had made their closing remarks, the jury exited the courtroom and began their deliberation. By 5:50 that same night, the jury had come to a verdict. At 7 o'clock, Turko, shackled and handcuffed, was led back into the courtroom to hear his fate. On the count of murder of Albert Koster, Tony Turko was found guilty. Turko was sentenced to death via the electric chair. However, Turko's attorneys successfully appealed the initial sentence on the grounds of a technicality. Turko's lawyers noted that when the jury announced the guilty verdict, they failed to specify the degree of murder. The New Jersey Supreme Court granted Turko a new trial. The outcome would be the same though, as Turko was sentenced to the electric chair yet again, earning him the distinction of being one of only a few to be condemned to death twice. On January 29, 1924, Tony Turko and his accomplice Angelo Carlino were both executed by way of the electric chair at the state prison in Trenton, New Jersey. Back on the night of January 24, 1922, following the guilty verdict being announced, Tony Turko was being led back to his cell while accompanied by Irons. As he neared his cell, Turko turned back to face Irons and asked him, "Now are you satisfied?" With a stone-cold face of justice, Irons simply replied, "I am not satisfied, but the law is."
While the grass grows underneath my feet, been running out of time for so long. Hello, 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 yeah. Now I'm running out of so long. Hello, 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 yeah. Hope I got the time to tell you. Hello, 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 yeah.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for checking out this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. It took a lot of time between life stuff getting in the way, school, and then besides that, the research and writing process for this one just took me a little bit longer, making sure I got a really good story for you guys. I do just want to give a quick shout out to a good friend of mine, Haley, for giving me the motivation to finish this episode up and get it out there for you guys. So thank you again for watching. I hope you enjoy and have a good one.
Trembling across my fingers out of sight. Hello, 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 yeah. I was lost inside of me.